Hello, I'm Diana Reich, the Artistic Director of the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival, Join the Conversation, and I'd like to welcome you from wherever you may be watching. Transforming the way that the festival is delivered, from live appearances to an online version, and offering an even stronger, more diverse and plentiful series of events, is a reflection of our belief that literature and the arts provide a catalyst for dialogue, creativity, empathy, laughter and tears, binding communities together. We're enormously grateful to all our speakers who've dedicated their time and talents to the festival. Please buy their books as a way of enhancing the festival experience. It's my pleasure to invite you, on behalf of my colleagues and board, as well as myself, to join the conversation. We hope that you'll do so in person next November, if at all possible. Charleston in South Carolina is a beautiful, historic and hospitable town, and the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival will definitely be going from strength to strength.
I'm Suzanne Pollack, Director of Development for the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. This year, more than ever, we are so grateful to our generous donors, returning and new, who've made it possible to offer free sessions to everyone everywhere, building a truly international audience. There's still time for you to become a donor. We're taking donations throughout the month of November. So if you would like to become a sponsor, and we urge you to do so, please contact me using my email on the website. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Leah Ryan and I'm the Festival Director for the Charleston to Charleston Literary Festival. I'm coming to you from the stunning library at 20 South Battery in Charleston, South Carolina. It's a timeless space. Sitting here, you could be living in any century, taking in the beautiful view over the Charleston Harbor. Speaking of timeless, imagine this. You live in a world without hunger, without war. It's incredible. But every night when you go to sleep, you're transported back to Elizabethan England, where you strike up a hot affair with William Shakespeare. Sounds great, right? But the catch is, when you wake up, the changes you made in the past have altered your present until it becomes something unrecognizable, a dystopia. Imagine how that would feel. Or don't, because author Sandra Newman has already done it for you in her novel, The Heavens. I'm honored to introduce you to Sandra today. She's the author of novels like The Country of Ice Cream Star. She co-authored the hugely successful How Not to Write a Novel, and also wrote the Western Lit Survival Kit and Read This Next. She lives in New York, and if you're not following her on Twitter, trust me, you should. Speaking with Sandra today is Regina Marler. She writes for the New York Times Review of Books and is the author of the book Bloomsbury Pie. She lives in San Francisco and is a wonderful friend to our festival. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to introduce you to Sandra Newman and Regina Marler.
Hello and welcome to the Charleston to Charleston Festival. I am Regina Marler. I'm a scholar of Virginia Woolf and editor of Vanessa Bell's Letters, and I write on contemporary fiction and art for the New York Review of Books and elsewhere. I'm in Sonoma County, which is just north of San Francisco. And I'm talking this morning with novelist Sandra Newman about The Heavens, her 2019 novel. It's a love story, it's speculative fiction and a time travel tale. And it received rave reviews. And of course, we always begin. What's the spark for this piece?
What is the spark? Well, it started in a sort of a lighthearted way and became much more serious as I worked on it. So my husband and I have a sort of a game that we play where we try to come up with ideas for best-selling novels or for TV shows. So like one of his all-time greats is the idea of a TV show that's about an improv troupe that solves crimes. And that was one of his good ones. And I came up with this one, which was Outlander, but Shakespeare. I find like either people have never heard of Outlander, which is baffling to me, or they're big fans. Like there's nothing in between. So I'm gonna explain Outlander. So bear with me
Yes.
if you think that everyone knows Outlander, because they don't, weirdly. But so Outlander is a gigantically successful historical romance novel, or historical time travel romance novel, about a woman who goes back in time and has a love affair with a Scottish Highlander in, I believe, the 17th century. I actually don't remember the historical period that well. I remember the sex scenes really well, but not the historical period. So anyway, the idea was that this would be a woman, a bookish woman who went back in time and had an affair with Shakespeare. And I thought, well, that's a natural, that's got to sell. Like, even if it's terrible, it would sell. Ha ha ha, which I win the game. That's sort of the idea of the game. But at that time, I was trying to come up with an idea for a new book, which is a lot of, how did you come up with the idea for this book? Well, I spent like 6 months desperately trying to come up with an idea for a book, is the true answer to that a lot of the time for writers. And this was how I came up with that, essentially. But part of that also was my husband eventually saying to me after 3 months of working on other ideas, why don't you actually write that Shakespeare book? I can see you turning that into an interesting book. And I was like, no, that's not true. But then I thought about it and I thought, oh yeah, if you twist it just this way and then that way, then it becomes a serious book about history and how Shakespeare has affected history, how art affects history. If you go back in time and meet Shakespeare and change his life, what do you change about the world that you go back to when you wake up back in the 21st century? So that became the book. It's about a woman who, in her sleep, she has a second life in the Elizabethan period. And in that life, she eventually meets Shakespeare and they have an affair. But every time she wakes up every morning back in New York in the 21st century, and has a whole other life there. And every time she wakes up, the world is a little bit different because of the things that she's done in the past that subtly or not so subtly changed history.
But it's a little bit worse too. And you begin, it's dystopian, but you begin as a utopia. Your 21st century, or just barely 21st century New York is a brighter, happier place. It's the first year without war, say, and there's a Green Party president. President Chen, a woman. So how did that come to you? Begin better, and then every time she comes back, it's worse.
I don't know, it just came to me. It's one of those things and I immediately knew this is the idea. I think that was actually the moment when I thought, oh yes, I want to write this book, was when I thought I could start out in a much better world and have it become more and more like our world and have us experience that the way that it's becoming a dystopian universe, but actually it's just becoming our world. And I think, and it's sort of interesting because obviously, you can tell from there's no war, there's a Green Party president, obviously. I'm very left-wing, so my version of a utopia is ineluctably left-wing, and I kind of struggled with that, but ultimately your imagination is your imagination, and that's what I ended up with. And I have to say that the only really bad reviews it got were from right-wing publications.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Did they object to that beginning, to your vision of utopia there? It's brief, that part, before the dreams begin to take us somewhere darker. But what was it?
They didn't say anything about the politics, but I have my suspicions. So this is not I can't prove this. It could totally be a fluke or a coincidence, but I do feel I worry about it. I don't have that many right-wing friends, and my right-wing friends were fine with it, but they're my friends, so that's a different thing. Maybe right-wing people who don't already like me as a person would find it really difficult and offensive, and I can't. It's strange, your blind spots. I can't really tell if it just reads as a utopia, and you think, as a right-winger, you think, well, it wouldn't really be like that. And I actually have a character towards the end of the book in the 21st century like it's 9/11 and they're all having this kind of disaster party on 9/11 and trying to comfort each other. And one of the people who has just actually fled from the Twin Towers, barely surviving, is very right wing, and he's among all these left wingers. And so he is sort of the voice of that person, that disgruntled reviewer from the Daily Mail who hated the book. but,
Come on.
but anyway.
Funny. Well, it's also, I mean, every writer has, preoccupations and obsessions, things they return to, things they're working on, maybe from different angles as they move from book to book. And this is your second post-apocalyptic novel, The Country of Ice Cream Star, which was just your third novel, so it's just before, is also it's set in a dystopia, post-apocalyptic world. What is it? Because also I just saw, congratulations, I just saw your book news. You've sold the next novel, and it's also a different world. Tell me a little bit about these post-apocalyptic scenarios and their appeal for you and your themes.
Yeah, I think since childhood, I think since I understood the potential or the possibility of an apocalypse, I've been fascinated by it. And some of it, I think, obviously some of it is fear, a fear that I think is very commonly shared now. But also there is a longing for a world that is just different. So as a person who is in a society in which you feel like a misfit, or where you feel critical or uncomfortable, or that this society is somehow just intolerable in some way, in its flavor, in its essence, in the basic structure, which I think is a lot of teenagers, but certainly me as a teenager. You read apocalyptic narratives as this way of having a fantasy about everything you know being gone, but also kind of admitting that involves a lot of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And there must be some part of it that's hostile, that's about glorying in the destruction. Although, like, I don't experience that. I'm willing to let that remain subconscious, but I'm sure that must be there in me too. Like, I try to write, some of my dystopias are actually like The Country of Ice Cream Star, the dystopian world that they live in, like the post-apocalyptic world, is actually pretty nice. It's not that terrible. There has been a plague, but it was in the past, and the kind of crumbled civilization that we're introduced to isn't really that terrible in everyday life. I'm not going to go into the ways in which it is terrible, because that's just getting off into a different book altogether. But I think that's sort of I'm fascinated by the apocalypse and the fear of the apocalypse and the image of the apocalypse, but I'm also fascinated by utopianism. And I very deeply believe that utopianism has gotten a bad rap. I understand why. It's not like I don't understand what went wrong with the Soviet Union and Maoist China, and I grasp that. I don't have a problem with that. I know that was bad. But I think that utopianism in its essence is just the belief that we can do better. Like, we can come up with a different system that might be better than this system. And especially when we keep it relatively modest and practical, we really get nowhere without some form of utopianism, without some form of positive dream and not just a critical negative dream. Mm-hmm. And like, I always think, like, with this book, it became very clear that actually our world, when you compare it to the world of Shakespeare, is already a utopia. There are so many things that we have that people in Shakespeare's time would consider utopian, from the internet to the ability to walk down the street after the sun sets and see where you're going and not have to carry a sword to be safe. They had none of those things. Infant mortality, of course, was massive. There are so many things that they just did not have and could not conceive of having that would seem utopian to them, that we just take for granted.
This makes me think too about the historical research that you had to do for this. And it's interesting because it's a slender book for you. The previous book was, 600 pages. So you have distilled what looks like, a couple of years of research into Elizabethan England to this slender novel. How did you dive into that material, and how did you select, those few nuggets so we don't feel like we're wading through detail about the past, and so forth. And of course the language too. I mean, you developed this patois in your previous novel. It's based on African American vernacular, and you have to do in a way the same thing. You have models for the speech, but you've got to have them saying what you want them to say. It's tricky.
It just took an awful lot of work, actually. And it's a very interesting process. Like, I'm not a historian, and I'm not a scholar, and I'm not a natural scholar either. I find it very difficult to retain information. And my mind wanders, like, oh, every single thing that could make you bad as a scholar, I have. But I just had to do it. So I went and did it and read all of these books about Elizabethan England and articles and et cetera. And it was like you would find this nugget, as I think you said, and want to put it in the book somehow. And I'd end up with like pages and pages of notes with, on each page there'd be one nugget that I really wanted in the book, that I thought was really fascinating. And I would try to work to put it in the book somehow. But also you have the ongoing story, and there are things that, like, the story wants something here, and you just be amazed how difficult it is to find out simple things like, what kind of blankets did they have in the middle classes in 1592, as opposed to, like, you might be able to find it for 1640, but you'd be like, is that close enough? Can I trust that? It's really difficult. So I was just like looking through to see if I could find a good bit to read. And I was reading some of the stuff set in the Elizabethan period and remembering all of the work, like getting flashbacks of finding these little details, like, oh my God, this page has 100 details. It cost me 100 hours of my life. But it is such a fascinating period, and it kind of springs into language in this wonderful way. There's a reason Shakespeare wrote then and not, in some other period, because it's an intensely, richly verbal period when everybody used to coin phrases, coin terms. They come up with words. It was a pastime at the court to come up with new words, which is something, if you imagine that happening in Donald Trump's White House, it's sort of, words they would come up with are not ones that I think, I guess they probably do that, but in some, let's not think about it.
Maybe imagine, I could maybe imagine Shakespeare in Pope's day. I can maybe a little play, that verbal play, and I could maybe imagine him as a rapper now, possibly. Yeah.
Yes, this is a subject very close to my heart from Ice Cream Star. The extraordinary, the vitality of African American English as opposed to white American English is just ridiculous.
Yeah, there's no comparison. So before, I'd love you to read from maybe from the Elizabethan section, something from that. But I also have, I wanted to say that this is not when Kate, your 21st century character, dreams, she wakes as a woman who is a real historical figure, Emilia Bassano, who is associated with many with the Shakespeare's the Dark Lady of the sonnets. Before we go into that, tell me, how did that, instead of making her just a random Elizabethan, what was that moment when you thought, oh, here's someone who could fulfill my narrative ends and who's a fascinating character? How did that come about?
Well, the original idea was it would be a woman in the woman in the present who goes back in time and has the affair with Shakespeare should be Shakespeare's Dark Lady, which again, it's something that I find that, again, a lot of people don't know about, that in Shakespeare's sonnets, which are the only personal probably personal poetry, potentially personal poetry. He left behind, there are two characters who emerge, well, actually three characters, but the third one is kind of boring. So I'm just gonna focus on the two characters, the fair youth and the dark lady. And what seems to come out of the sonnets is that there's a love triangle between them, where Shakespeare is having an affair both with the fair youth and the dark lady, but the fair youth is also having an affair with the dark lady. And, you know, that may just be an artifact of the nature of sonnet writing, but we don't know. We just don't know, and we probably never will know. And there are different candidates for the fair youth and the dark lady. The fair youth is much more likely to have been accurately identified. So I have him as probably the most popular candidate, the Earl of Southampton, who was a patron of Shakespeare and many other poets at the time. And Emilia Bassano is the most popular candidate of everyone, I think, for the dark lady, although there's no way of knowing. And the real dark lady probably was just some person. But Emilia Bassano is fascinating. She comes from this family of Italian musicians who were all brought over by Henry VIII to play at court. And she herself was the mistress of the Lord Chamberlain of England, Hunsdon, who is also Queen Elizabeth's cousin, possibly her half-brother too, she has this whole complex history. And also, like, notably, although this doesn't come into my book because she only published this book in her 40s and she's in her 20s at the time of my book, she published what is probably the first published volume of poetry by an English woman, which Salve Deus Rex Judiorum, forgive my Latin, which is non-existent, and it's a very interesting, like, book in its own right. And some people have used that to argue that she wrote Shakespeare's plays just because it's a fun thing to say, but actually there's no similarity between her poetry and the poetry of Shakespeare. So I think that's stretching a point, but she is a genuine mind. And I think that even if she isn't the dark lady, there are various indications that Shakespeare knew her. And I like to think that possibly in real life, you know, although like my fiction has her as his girlfriend, I like to think in real life, maybe he knew her as a poet and actually respected her work. And that's why there are references to Emilia's and Bassano's in his work.
All over his work, and that's some of the argument made, you know, that for her authorship of Shakespeare is that, you know, everything he seems to know, you know, she could have known, and that she went many places, you know, in court and so forth, where he didn't. So it's a fun theory.
It really is, yeah.
So would you like to read something from the Elizabethan section?
This is actually shortly after Emilia Bassano and the Earl of Southampton meet in my book. And I'm going to try to, yes. And it's just a conversation between the two of them. They're riding on horseback to his country house at Coudray. So he's essentially invited her away. People at that time would often just go and stay in each other's houses for months. It's a style that is lost. So he's just invited her, and they're going to go and spend months with a bunch of other people at his country house. They were a horse in the night. It was 2 days later, and Southampton had invited her to his country house, Coudray. They were having a sudden friendship, because they were lonesome and so young, and neither had a thing in the world to do. So the night, with its moon and hooting owls, odd rustles in the trees that might have been brigands but weren't, again and again. From a burnt-out cottage they passed rose a frail, excitable twinkling of bats. Some of the men rode ahead, some behind. Southampton rode beside her, as if courting her, although he wasn't courting her. He was complaining, as the beautiful do, of the girl he was expected to marry, who was no maid, who had lain with 2 men, of his certain knowledge. Aye, and he had known her from a child. She was a serpent of luxury. He complained of the court, a stew of slow-headed ruffians who thought it a great jest to piss in the fireplace, blockheads all, whose most manlike work was feigning to be the old queen's lovers. Nay, their most manlike work was sleep, where they might dream they were men. Nay, it was playing at flapdragon. He took a hand from his reins to mimic the flapdragoner's hasty gesture of snatching a raisin from a burning cup of brandy. Emilia laughed and said, "Indeed, we are prodigal of our time, that we spend it in such flapdragons and flatteries. But, good my lord, is not all life beneath the heavens in idleness? For as the prophet saith, all is vanity. Vanitas, vanitatum, et omnia vanitas. Yet we need not be idle-witted. We may pray, we may become wiser by study. But wisdom is also vanity. 'Tis a nonsense that passeth and is no more. So the prophet writes, there shall be no remembrance of the wise, nor of the fool forever. What now is, shall all be forgotten." Then the earl agreed with her, grew heated and glad, and complained of his studies at the Inns of Court, and the scholars there, who every night turned a dozen hogsheads of wine to piss, and a dozen fresh country maids to whores. But there must be something in the world yet pure. Must there not be one thing pure? Well a day, said Emilia, if there be a pure thing, 'tis not a man. Very Elizabethan.
Oh, absolutely. And the fluff dragon, yeah.
Dragon, but
we have some questions, and this might be a good moment to bring
good.
in. We have some questions from readers. Okay. The heavens occupies many different worlds and times. It's a unique achievement. However, were you at all inspired by Virginia Woolf's Orlando?
Oh yes, actually, yeah, I've thought of it a lot, and I didn't reread it. I tried. It wasn't really conscious, but I had just reread it like 2 years before I thought of writing this book, so I didn't reread it. But that book is so wonderful, and it has that the kind of richness of Elizabethan detail and that real feel of physically being in the world that I tried to capture. And some of the sexual politics of the time, which were complex, what gender was at that time and what was considered, the definition of heterosexuality, homosexuality was hardly existent. There was some idea of it. And in fact, you can find that there are drawings of, some physician made a set of drawings to show what the heads of sodomites looked like as compared to the heads of catamites. So, they did have they were groping towards becoming really disgusting on the subject, but they hadn't quite got there yet. So it was just like sex was bad. If you had sex outside of wedlock, it was bad. And it was really bad if you did it with a man, but basically it was just bad and super bad in different ways. So yeah. So yes, I was actually. Yes is the simple answer.
And of course, I mean, generally that freedom, to dip in and out of, another period and the identities and so forth, that I see a little Woolf in there as well. Okay, we'll bring it back to your 21st century sections. Someone asks, your utopian vision of New York in 2020 could hardly be further from the current reality. Can you still imagine a Green Party senator becoming the first female president of the United States?
Okay, maybe not the Green Party, but that's a little bit anachronistic. But it's sort of an interesting. I think it's really sad how negative everyone's become. And there was one dinner that I had with a bunch of publishing people just before the publication of this book, where I was talking about the utopian aspect of it. And I said, I think we need to think about this, what if there's still hope? And I said that, and everyone's face around the table changed. Like they hadn't considered that there might be hope in a long time. And it's odd how we get set in these very negative ways of interpreting and seeing the world. We forget, nobody could possibly have predicted all of the terrible things that have happened just in this year.
No.
And nobody did. Like we just didn't foresee all of this happening, but we also can't foresee the positive things that could possibly happen that could help the work that we do to try to make the world a better place. There are breakthrough moments. Like nobody really predicted the fall of apartheid or the fall of the Soviet Union. Although, it's actually the fall of the Soviet Union didn't work out that great, but for a time it really seemed
Berlin Wall, Berlin Wall coming down. And that's,
And the huge opportunity that represented, that those changes represent. Things can happen for good or ill. So I think there's still a lot of potential for us to live in a world that would seem utopian to us now. Will we be able to make that happen? I don't know. I mean, I tend to be as pessimistic as most people a lot of the time, but I do still reserve I reserve some room for hope.
It's good. Good. I like that. I haven't talked about your other work, your other wonderful work very much. And I haven't talked about your incredible Twitter account, your social media presence. You and your husband, Howard Middlemark, are among the funniest people on Twitter. And I did somewhere here, it was hard, but I tried to find a couple examples because people, if they aren't, if anyone's on Twitter and not yet following Sandra, you must be doing this. There's a lot of politics on it, but there's also this, incredibly funny stuff. So the tweet: if you stopped at a deserted rest area to use the restroom and found it filled with turtles who all silently, balefully turned their heads to look at you, how many turtles would it take to scare you off? That number is your uncanny rest area restroom turtle number. It's wonderful. Your absurd humor. And this is another recent favorite of mine. Is this next to a video of a political rally, and you say, you caption it essentially: large, tightly packed crowds gather in Staten Island to offer their living hearts to the priest of the sun. We wish you well, Huitzilopochtli, said GOP congressional candidate Nicole Malliotakis. Take our beating hearts and rise from the icy land of winter. I love it. It's very good. You're a bright spot on Twitter. And you also wrote other funny and wonderful books. With Howard, you wrote How Not to Write a Novel, which is full of funny examples of and incredibly good advice too on natural sounding dialogue. You say many beginning authors seem to believe that contractions like sexual intercourse began in 1963, and nobody before that year ever said I'm or don't. Others believe that contractions aren't used by anyone with a graduate degree, a country club membership, or a British passport. Still others would seem to be unaware that contractions exist. So it's terrific. And so there is that side to your work. And we have a question from a named person, Thomas Pluck. And I have to name him because he has a beautiful English name. It sounds very Elizabethan to me, Thomas Pluck. So he is asking a question about the novel just before this one. This is a bit of a throwback, but what inspired you to write The Country of Ice Cream Star? And do you now feel like you were prescient as the news around us continues to unfold? So perhaps another post-apocalyptic question.
Yeah, what inspired me to, okay, so The Country of Ice Cream Star, I think what he's referring to, the basic premise of The Country of Ice Cream Star is it's a world like maybe 100 years in the future, and there's been a plague which killed almost everyone.
Oh, that's true. It has to. The question has to be about the plague. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think this is about the plague, and this particular plague, everybody is now born having it, so everyone has been infected, and it does still kill you, but it only becomes fatal when you hit the age of 18, 19 years old. So everybody who is alive at the beginning of the book, whom we meet in America, is under 20 years old. And so it's a world of children and teenagers. And I don't think like that wasn't particularly prescient in my view. I think it was just like a cool idea. And anybody could have come up with it. And where it came from is it's sort of lost in the depths of time. I think it was partly based actually on a book that my father wrote. This is a long story. I'm not going to go into it, but my father wrote a book for his children, of whom I'm not one, because I wasn't raised by him. So this is kind of a sad thing for me, because it wasn't part of my life. But he had 3 kids other than me who he did raise, and he wrote a book for them about an island in the sea in the distant future, where everybody is a child, and the children live for 1,000 years as children, and then when they reach puberty, they set out in a boat across the ocean and never come back. And so that was his odd thing that he did. And I think that was like, I didn't think of it consciously until after the book was finished, and I thought, did I steal that idea? That's kind of too close. But
the land of really lost boys.
yeah. It was kind of a fascinating thing to do on a lot of levels. But anyway.
Well, I wanted to ask too, I had read that you lived for 20 years in England. You lived in Germany, Russia, Malaysia. What brought you to those places? What 20 years in England? Why there?
I really just when I was 18 and kind of up in the air and not doing anything, my father went to London on a business trip, and he took me along, and I fell in love with an ice cream man in Hyde Park and decided that I must go back. And that was really it. I mean, my father helped me initially to go back. Although, like later, it was such a disastrous decision on every level. Like I was poor for so long after making that decision. But at that time, my father, I think, was trying to get. This is a different father, incidentally. Like, so it's complicated. We don't want to get into my whole family. But anyway, my second log suffered.
Alas, we only have the hour.
Yeah. He decided that it would be good for me to try and live independently. So he sent me to England, where, I don't know, it's like throwing a kid into the deep end. And I did manage to come out of it all right eventually. So I suppose.
You went to university and you got your master's also there. So
yeah. For the rest of the travel, I liked traveling. I always wanted to travel, but some of those places. So another like crazy decision that I made was that I, for a brief period, was a professional gambler, which was because it was playing blackjack in casinos, and we would travel around to different countries to find good games, basically, where the rules were favorable to the player. And I was hired to do that from an advertisement in the newspaper. So I answered an ad in the newspaper for a professional gambler's assistant, and it actually was a job for somebody to play blackjack. And he taught us up and took a team of us around.
Had you ever played before, or were you just needed a job, any job, and took that one, or pursued that one?
I was in a dead-end typing job, and I saw it in the newspaper when I was supposed to be looking for a better, respectable job. I could never get interviews. I was like useless. I've always been really useless at earning money and doing anything responsible or respectable. But I was very good at playing blackjack. And so, I mean, I didn't know that then, but I went for this job, and, you know, we hit it off, and when he taught me, I was good at it. And so I joined the team and went off. And astonishingly, I eventually gave it up because I was not even responsible enough to play blackjack consistently. I got bored and couldn't take it anymore. And there was a lot of like tension. We were all like living on top of each other in hotel rooms, and the tension was insane. I was one of the last to leave, in fact. So I suppose I I give myself a hard time for being irresponsible and giving up my job, but actually like 8 people left before me. So
They're responsible for giving up your gambling job.
yeah. Well, well, you can't help but have regrets when you give up that job. It does sound glamorous, even though it's intensely boring to play cards literally all day long. So
It may be one of those things that's better to have done than to be currently doing.
absolutely better to have done. Yeah.
So you have another section from the contemporary part of the novel that we had talked about you reading, and I would love to hear it, and then maybe we could ask another question.
Okay, I'm just going to set this up a little bit. This is from the very first chapter. We haven't really talked about the main romantic relationship in the book isn't between Shakespeare and Emilia, but between Kate, the woman who's having the dreams about the Elizabethan period, and Ben, and who's just a guy. Actually, Ben is just a guy. And so the contemporary sections are from Ben's point of view. And in the first chapter, they meet at what is described as a rich girl's party. We get to know the rich girl, but at first he comes to the party. It's just like a rich girl's party that he's been invited to by someone who knows her. And he meets Kate and falls for her immediately. And so this is after they've had their first meeting. He met her outside when he went out for a cigarette, and she's out there walking the dog. And they start talking and come back in together and go out onto the balcony where she begins to talk to someone else. So, and the someone else is this New Zealander who's also a major character in the book, who lives in the apartment of the rich girl. So now the windy balcony, the obsolete stars, the city a mystery of glittering towers. Kate and the New Zealander were talking about the great man theory of history, according to which human progress was driven by superlative people like Socrates or Muhammad, who single-handedly changed the world. Kate defended this idea, while the New Zealander pooh-poohed it and refused to believe she was serious. He said, "How could anyone be that much better? We all have such similar biologies." "They wouldn't have to be that much better," said Kate. "It would be all the circumstances lining up, like with any unusual event, like a supervolcano or a major earthquake." She looked at Ben. Ben said, "Major earthquakes aren't that unusual." "Ben's a geologist," Kate told the New Zealander. "But is he a great geologist?" the New Zealander said. Kate laughed. Ben laughed too, although he also wondered if this was a slight that might diminish him in Kate's eyes. The New Zealander said he was going to get another drink and left. Ben's heart was suddenly racing. Scraps from the Apollinaire she'd quoted surfaced in his mind. "Mon beau membre, Assanin, le sacré bordel entre tes cuisses." Sorry about my terrible French, it's awful. But anyway, "My stupid, beautiful dick, the sacred bordello between your thighs." That's what it is in English. When she'd said it, it had certainly seemed like flirting, but it might have just been the only Apollinaire she could call to mind. Now Kate smiled at him vaguely and looked back at the French doors. Her face caught the light and her smooth cheek shone. Some new intention appeared in her eyes, a bad moment where he thought she was about to ditch him. But she turned to him again, smiling wonderfully, and said, "I've got the key to the roof deck. I'm sleeping on the roof if that sounds like something you might want to do." He was nodding, breathless, while she explained that Sabine, the rich girl, was her good friend. Kate often slept on the roof. She had an inflatable bed up there. "It blows up with a mechanism," Kate said, making a mechanism gesture in the air. He laughed. He was lightheaded. He made the mechanism gesture back, and Kate took him by the sleeve, just like that, and led him back to the party. She said, "I'd better ask Sabine, but she'll say yes." And actually, I'll stop there, although it's kind of random. I realized afterwards it's a kind of a random snatch of that scene. I was trying to get in some dialogue. And
Yeah, you know, it's a good love story, and it has the you know, you convey very well that feeling of sort of tumbling into love, and how the rest of the world is this, you know, it becomes a little rosier around the couple, and then it is so poignant and painful that Kate feels that when she's in love or when she's going through a breakup, that her dreams intensify. Mm-hmm. But what this means is that as she falls more deeply, you know, in love with Ben and the dreams intensify, that also intensifies the corrosive effect that the dreams have. And so it's this terrible tension in that.
Yeah, basically, when she dreams, the world changes. So she keeps waking up in a world she doesn't recognize. Mm-hmm. But since for everybody else, the world was always like that, like they're living in that other history. Yeah. They never knew the history that she remembers from the day before. Mm-hmm. So she's waking up next to a Ben who belongs to this other timeline that she created in her sleep, which sounds very complicated, but hopefully in the book, it just, you can figure out without too much difficulty. But anyway, that means that her reality gradually diverges from the reality that she's actually living in. She doesn't remember things. She doesn't know who the president is. She doesn't know all kinds of basic things about what's normal here. She's shocked to learn that people actually made nuclear weapons and that they exist. Like when she begins to asking, like, well, how many of them are there? Are there 10? Are there, you know, and then she can't sleep when she finds out how terrible this world is, which makes her seem insane to the people around her. And in fact, functionally, like I've talked about this a lot, like that question of her mental illness. Is she supposed to be mentally ill? Is her? And to me, it's clear at the Elizabethan period that she dreams is real. But still, in the terms of the world she wakes up in, she is mentally ill. She doesn't live in our reality. She is functionally mentally ill. And she does eventually end up having her life fall apart around her, as happens to people who suffer from mental illness. And it affects the people around her profoundly and really damages them, especially Ben, as happens when people have mental illness. So we see all that from Ben's point of view, as he sees from his point of view, the woman he's fallen deeply in love with and wants to marry and have children with become really irretrievably insane.
It's doubly tragic. He can't, you know, he's deeply involved with her, and he's, you know, moving toward a future with her, and she's becoming weirder and weirder, more and more ill, and he gets pulled into, you know, when you're caring for someone who's mentally ill, or who in this case, you know, you perceive as mentally ill, you know, it's completely absorbing. And he had a mentally ill mother, so it's a doubly tragic situation. It's extremely upsetting, and I think that works very well too in adding to that, you know, the horror of the world that she is perhaps, you know, creating through her dreams.
Yeah, and it's sort of interesting because in a way, of course, like her view of the world, which I hope readers will see, of how horrifying things like homelessness and nuclear weapons are, which are all brand new to her, feels like a kind of bracing sanity too. Yeah. But it's interesting because Ben feels judged by it. Like he's no longer that pure person who can see things in that way, at the same time as he's framing her as having a mental illness. Yeah. It's interesting. And I think that's something that does happen when you're, I mean, I've been actually in relationships, I've been both the crazy person and the person who, you know, I've played both of those roles. You know, people have
to play both
roles. To get therapy so many times, and also like been in the position of saying to someone, "Should I be calling an ambulance on you right now?" You know, so, but it's interesting when you are dealing with someone who has mental illness. They will often say things that seem to you like stunningly sane, although they're completely detached from the real world that everyone else lives in. So you have to try to convince them not to think that way, even though the idea that they had is better than the common idea. It's really complex, actually.
This is about the point when I usually ask people what is next for you. I do know what's next, because you have your fourth novel coming out. It's called your fifth novel. It'll be The Men. But can you? Are you done with it? Or are you still working?
Basically, it's sort of finished, but it's going to go through another rewrite still. It's still, like, how I would put it is that the ending is still a little mushy. You know, I need to sort out the ending a little bit more, but it's in England, it's already got a publisher. It's going to come out from Granta, which is awesome. And when I get the next rewrite done, then hopefully we will sell it in the United States too. So, and that book it's kind of an odd utopian book, dystopian, I don't know. But in that book, it's set in a world where all the men disappear. So all the men, every male disappears just on a day, and the women have to go on without them. So it's sort of tragic, but also in this conception of that scenario, everything immediately becomes much better. So, so it's just like, no apologies for that. And I will say, like, because this is a question a lot of people has, well, how do you deal with trans people in that situation? And it was really difficult. So it's not something that I didn't think about. And there are definitely trans people in the book. And how it sort of had to be for the plot that I wanted to write, that trans women disappeared with the men. So that's one of the tragedies, actually, of this world, is that the same asshole God who gave us the wrong body parts in the first place, or that's one way of looking at it, would make that decision. Like, I gave you a Y chromosome, you know, you're on this side of the line.
Determinism, yeah, it's
Yeah.
a binary vision, yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of strange. It's like one of those things where you come up with a conception and then it immediately gives you all of these philosophical problems that you then have to solve in ways that feel unsatisfying, in the same way that real life philosophical solutions feel unsatisfying.
So that was the premise. It must have just come to you like over coffee or something. You said a world in which the men disappear.
Yeah, and I have no memory of that premise coming to me, actually. it just was there, and I didn't work on it for years, and then I finally got around to it.
Okay. And there's another novel in the works after The Men?
Yeah, I'm not sure which one it's going to be, though. I'm working on a few different things, so we'll see.
It's very exciting. Well, thank you so much, Sandra. I have really, really enjoyed talking with you about this fantastic book. And
Thank you.
here's my copy to hold it up, everybody. And at this point, people would be, you know, if we were in Charleston, which is a wonderful place to be for this small, exquisite festival, we would all be, you know, the people in the audience would be rushing out to the lobby where the books are piled up, and they would be lining up to buy your book and then to get it signed by you. So I imagine doing that now. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. It's really, really great to meet you in person.
You too. Bye.
Bye.